This past week, I got a call from one of my sons-in-law, and I have many, and he said, I need your advice. Now, how many fathers are real pleased to hear a son-in-law asking his advice? And he said, I've been tasked to give a sermonette. What should I do? I've never done this before. And so we went through a number of things with regard to sermonette. And I said, I do like to give one a quarter or at least a few times a year in order to understand a sermonette. And I said, one thing you might do is consider conflicting, what seemingly are conflicting scriptures, because people who are critics who are not Christians or critics of God or the Bible will pull out the Bible and try to say, see, that's inconsistent, because when they take a first look or a first glance, they think, how can that possibly be the word of an inerrant God? And unbelievers seem to delight when they stumble across some contradictory scriptures. So I'm going to take a look today at Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, because these on the surface appear as though they seem to contradict each other. So Proverbs 24, verses starting in verse 4, do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Well, that's an interesting thought because it sounds entirely reasonable. If some people are foolish, and if you don't engage with foolishness, well, then you don't get involved in whatever they're involved in. There's an old saying that you shouldn't wrestle with a pig because you will both get dirty and the pig kind of likes it. Well, so it's really silly to engage in a foolish argument, perhaps someone who has baited us in the hopes of getting into an argument. Well, then we can't expect a good outcome. So we wind up appearing just as foolish as the person who baited us into the argument. So now let's go to the next verse in Proverbs 26, verse 5. And it says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Well, this seems entirely reasonable as well, because you can't just let a foolish statement go unchallenged. Otherwise, it appears that your silence indicates that you're in agreement with the fool. But here in Proverbs 24, verses 4 and 5, we have seemingly opposite instructions from God's Word, the Holy Scriptures. How can we possibly reconcile these two verses that call for different responses to what appears on the surface to be the same situation? Well, I grew up in a rural neighborhood. The Northern European immigrants had come to America and had settled and developed farms in the upper Midwest Prairie and south central Minnesota. When I was young, family had grandparents or great-grandparents who had homesteaded the land, usually 160 acres. And the government would grant free land to the pioneers who lived on that land, and they made improvements. You had to build a house and farm it for 7 years. And then after 7 years, if you could prove that, the government gave you free title to 160 acres. Well, my father and grandfather told me a story about their older neighbors. This was around the year 1900, turn of the century, Mr. Geyer and Mr. Lake. I knew the great-grandchildren of those pioneers. Well, these two fellows, Mr. Geyer and Mr. Lake, were always at odds. It didn't seem like they would agree on anything. One took the opposite stance. If one said one thing, the other would say the opposite. It didn't matter if it was up versus down, right versus left, high versus low, sweet versus sour, whatever it was, the other one always took a contradictory or conflicting stance. And in those days, we're talking pre-electricity and pre-automobile. The neighborhood people were often quite helpful. They would help each other build houses, build barns. I know that in 1904, my great-grandfather rebuilt a barn, and there was a big housewarming party. Everybody participated and celebrated. Well, one day, around the turn of the century, Mr. Geyer came home from a nearby town in his horse and buggy. He was extremely upset about some distressing news. I don't know what the news was, but he was so upset. He was beside himself with terrible frustration. He decided that life wasn't worth living anymore. Well, his wife was horribly distraught because her husband told her he was going to go to the barn and hang himself from the rafters. She was devastated at the thought of losing her husband, which meant she would lose her home. And as an immigrant, she'd be an abandoned widow in a strange land. And Mrs. Geyer could not persuade her husband, Mr. Geyer, dissuade him from his plan to commit suicide by hanging. Well, the horse and the buggy were right there, so she jumped into the buggy and went lickety-split off to the neighbor's house to get some help to prevent her husband from carrying out his self-destructive inquiries. But the nearest neighbor was Mr. Lake, the common oppositional neighbor, always in conflict with Mr. Geyer. But Mrs. Geyer felt she had no time to waste, so she sought help from the nearest neighbor, Mr. Lake. Mr. Lake heard the news, jumped into the buggy, drove back as fast as he could back to the Geyer farm, and he ran to the barn. And there was Mr. Geyer fashioning a rope into a hangman's noose so that he could hang himself from the rafters. Now, Mr. Lake, the obnoxious neighbor, who never got along with Mr. Geyer, shouted, "That's not how you make a hangman's noose. Here, let me show you how to do it the right way." Well, the two men got into an intense argument about the correct way to make a hangman's noose. The argument deteriorated into an even worse hostile confrontation. Mr. Geyer was so upset with his neighbor, Mr. Lake, that he, Mr. Geyer, forgot all about hanging himself and focused on the differences that were many between himself and Mr. Lake. So now let's go back to Proverbs 24, verses 4 and 5. "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him." We have to ask, well, it was certainly foolish of what Mr. Geyer was doing. But then we go to the next verse, verse 5. "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." So when we follow the advice in Proverbs 26, verse 4, we're to avoid foolishness. We don't get entangled with nonsense lest we get dragged down to a silly argument and we ourselves become looking like the fool. But in this situation, this scenario between Mr. Geyer and Mr. Lake didn't follow the advice in Proverbs 26, verse 4. Instead, he followed the advice in Proverbs 26, verse 5. Mr. Lake provoked and engaged Mr. Geyer as the best way to distract Mr. Geyer from hanging himself, and it worked. Mr. Lake intuitively knew that if he would have tried to get Mr. Geyer to not hang himself, Mr. Geyer would have taken the opposite stance just to prove Mr. Lake was wrong. Instead, Mr. Lake distracted the upset Mr. Geyer about the correct way to make that hangman's noose. And if you just knew what you were doing, you could tie this slip knot in thus and such of a way, and it would work much better. So he appeared oppositional and corrective, and focused on that confrontation. Well, in this life, we're all expected to learn to make better choices. In Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, they offer different approaches depending upon the circumstances. Now, some of you know I'm a social media manager, and it's in web pages in 3 countries. And sometimes we get very oppositional statements, even vulgar or obscene statements from people who are engaging in social media. And I have to make a decision when to engage someone and when to avoid engaging someone. So I turn to Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. Sometimes a person will exhibit genuine interest, but may be puzzled about some issue in the Bible. And other times, a person who's clearly a scorner or mocker is baiting to try to draw me into a discussion or an argument. Well, I take a look at the commenter's background, and it will assist me to determine whether or not to apply verse 4 or verse 5 of Proverbs 26. Just like Mr. Lake wisely chose to confront Mr. Geyer, and in so doing, Mr. Lake saved Mr. Geyer's life. And I mentioned I grew up with the great-grandchildren of both of them many years ago. So ultimately, we have to all learn to differentiate then according to the circumstance and make a good decision. In Joshua 24, verse 15, we hear the summary of what happens when we're faced to make a decision of good versus evil. In Joshua 24:15, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So let's keep Joshua 24:15 in mind about who we serve when we're confronted with evil. We may have to use different tactics in determining how and when and if to respond. Ultimately, our goal must be the same as Joshua's. But as for me and my house, I will serve the Lord.